You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I'm doing an artist interview. And this one should be interesting because, my guest today, Ian Capstick, describes himself as a recovering pundit, but also he is a podcaster, a fiber artist. He's multidisciplinary artist, I guess. And this one should get into a little bit of creative process and might get a little bit meta because he talks about other artists and their work on his show, Art Against Empire. Thank you so much for coming to join me, Ian Capstick.
Thank you for having me, Kyle. I appreciate it.
No, I'm excited. I always love to nerd out with fellow artists, and I think you're going to have a lot of interesting insights about media and things that I'm going to be honest, I'm a little ignorant about. So I'm always excited when I get the opportunity to learn from people who are smarter than me or have more experience than me in something, because fibers are an art form that, like, I appreciate when it's done well. I've seen spectacular examples, but the little bits that I've dabbled with fibers, I just know, like, it's not for me. I'm not the patient, meticulous person who can do that well. You know what I'm saying?
Fair.
So, I always like to, when I talk to someone, I like to start off with I love a good origin story. So, like, how did you come to the arts and what's your background? Can you tell us about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I am Ian, Danger Capstick. I enjoy being provocative, and I always have as a kid. And I think that that's how I found myself in the arts. And at first it was the theatrical arts. I was a young performer. I was just absolutely obsessed with the theater and the extravagance of it, and how many people were just in awe of what I was up to as a young person on the stage. I enjoyed performing right up until the point that I didn't, which was around the age of about 15 or 16 years old. And it was kind of like a punch in the gut. I went to a performing and visual arts high school, and I realized when I got there and I did my big audition for my first big show in grade 10, I didn't want to do it. And I sat down with my drama teacher, and I don't want to do this anymore. I have been a performer for a really long time already, and I'm only 15, 16 years old. Like, what do we do here? And they found me an incredible job as a publicist of all things. And as a performer behind, I'm not a performer, but as a prop maker behind the scenes. And that was the very first time that somebody had turned to me and said, okay, well, decorate the lobby, make props, do things, create things. As opposed to just using my own body to do it. I could use my hands. And then I had a physical, I made countless prop weapons for Narnia. And I just enjoyed the process of making things. And then through that, I came to cross stitch. My mom then started to teach me how to cross stitch, because in between shows and other things, I wanted to continue to make stuff. And my whole family are cross stitchers and crafters. We love craft. Like, if there's a craft, my family has done it. And I started putting all of those things together once I hit my adult life. And I was a creative director at an advertising agency. And I used to joke we were the craftiest agency around. I mean, if we could do it ourselves, we did. And we made incredible, beautiful pieces of interventions and art and things, including giant pieces of cross stitch. And I realized at that point, if I'm doing this and I love it so much, I need to invest in my own expressions, not just doing it for brands and causes that I love and giant banners in the street. I need to do this for myself. And what does that look like? So yeah, about 10 years ago, I focused with a couple of friends of mine on just a really good day-long session on what does the rest of my life look like. And as one does in their, I guess, mid-30s. And I had one of my friends said to me, like, you are an artist who hasn't found his medium yet. And I said right away, no, what I have, like, it's banners. Like, I love banners and textiles and fabric. And they were like, really? Because you don't do any of that. And I said, I do, but in my work. And they said, yeah, in your work. And I thought, oh my gosh, I need to start expressing myself. So the pandemic happened. You kind of forced alone to do a bunch of things, and I started making quilty banners, and it took off from there. So there you go. There's the origin story.
So that is interesting to me in so many ways. Like, as you started talking, like I started thinking about, like, it seems like you were somebody who was on that journey, like getting essentially tired of different media, from what I'm hearing. Like, it didn't sound like there was a catastrophic event where it's like, oh, you got up on stage and this one flopped and it was such a miserable experience. You just had this realization, like, this one is, the performance is fun, but not quite satisfying. I want something else. And then, constructing stuff is obviously so satisfying, seeing things to come together, at least for me, like that physical process of creating something and having a tangible product in the end is very satisfying. Seeing things come together, but it seems like you have gone from thing to thing, and the banners were, you said, your work in the professional sense, but not your satisfying art. Can you tease out, like, what's the difference there? Because Chuck Close would say, like, inspiration is for amateurs, the rest of it just go to work. Like, we're following that process in our artistic thing. Like, most artists think of the work they're doing for a living as their artistic work. How do you separate those?
You have a client, and so somebody's paying you money when you run in a large creative agency, and you don't get the final say. Whereas when you're an artist, you get the final say. That's it. I can decide when it's done. That's my first control that I have as an artist that I didn't have as an agency owner who creates these large, you have a lot of approvals, you have a lot of budgets. Yeah. So it's very easy, frankly, to separate it sometimes, because you're also working to somebody else's objectives and goals. What do you need to communicate very quickly to some policymakers? I live in Canada. My business was all around our nation's capital and getting voices who had been marginalized recognized and seen in our nation's capital in ways that they had never been seen before. So that was a lot of creative thinking out of the box. How do we use performance, theater, interventions, and ways of communicating that perhaps public policymakers, governments, politicians don't always expect? So that's things like banners sometimes being dropped from buildings in very large sense. So where I would be the creative director for a brand and a new brand or a new campaign, you really think about, again, what are the ways that I'm communicating with, some really boring people. If I had to be really honest with you, I love my politician friends, but they're boring as all heck, most of them. So, it's about clear direction, clear answers. And I guess that informs my work now, right? Like, if you take a look at any of my banners, they're incredibly clear in comparison to some of my other artist friends. I love their work deeply. Zach Foster, who's a good friend of mine who works in the same medium, quilting, his words run off the side of the banner and start at the other side of the banner. And that works really well for him. And that's what he's trying to put across. Mine are very clear, very graphic, so if you were to dig into the art history word that people are a little bit afraid of sometimes is there's two of them. It's graphic and craft. And there's something that I do specifically, which is that I meld these two things together. And if there's anything that my podcast attempts to do, it's erase the line and blur the line between so-called art and craft. Because fundamentally, this idea that craft is decorative and craft doesn't belong in museums, or, basket weaving or quilting or ceramics had long been relegated to a different part of the museum, sometimes even in the basement, or not even allowed in the museum, because it wasn't seen as art. It was seen as women's work. It was seen as decorative. And it was kind of lesser than. So one of the things I love to do now is just like physically erase those lines as much as possible, and just recognize that all art is craft and all craft is art to some degree or another. It's living potentially on a spectrum of utility, but I think some art can be very useful too. So that's just kind of where my head comes at the whole breaking down those paradigms.
And I fully agree with, like, your point about the separation of art and craft being very problematic historically, and thankfully we're seeing progress on that. And I do feel all creative work should be appreciated for what it is and, recognized, and the distinctions over media are, I want to say silly, but it's far worse than that. I'm struggling right now because there were a number of things that you brought up there that I wanted to explore, and I'm deciding which rabbit hole I want to go down first. So just to like wrap the initial point and the initial question, it sounds to me like, your work with advertising and everything like that, it's almost more like being a studio assistant where it's executing someone else's vision. And I'm curious, do you have, or have you had experiences where you have to turn away a client because they're trying to communicate a message that you don't agree with? Or are you saying like, you know what, I'm going to be the neutral, machine executing you know what I'm saying?
No,
Because I can see where that's ethically fraught.
No, I created MediaStyle as a deeply political agency that was specifically oriented towards promoting voices who'd been marginalized. So if you weren't that, and you didn't fit a certain profile, no, we said no. I do recall one day somebody called the Chemists Association of Canada came in, and I thought they were like chemists from universities. It turns out actually they made chemicals. And like one of their number one folks was, and they wanted to lobby on pesticides. So yeah, I've said no a lot. We probably said no a lot more than we said yes. Because again, when people see what you're capable of doing and it's fascinating and it's interesting and it's outside of the box and it's artistic, they kind of want it for themselves. But sometimes it was also like, I just don't feel like I'm the right person for that. Right. So, I mean, honestly, I left the agency over those types of issues where we were working a lot with Canada's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And, really, there were not a lot of us who were of that ancestry at the firm. And I thought, if we're going to continue to do this work, I think we need to do it better. And they decided not to. So now they're a different firm name. They do it in a very different way. So yeah, down to up to and including just saying, hey, I don't think I want to do this anymore. And not because I didn't believe in the things that we were pushing forward, but that I just needed to focus. At some point, like 6, 7, 8, 9 causes a year, when you're jumping from an environmental cause to a human rights cause to a sexual health rights I got burned out and just like, I don't want to do this anymore. So I really saw art as refilling my cup, reinfusing me with this passion again for design. And again, it's, people are always debating art or design. Blend them all. Art, design, craft. It's all the same thing in the world that I live in. And that honestly probably limits me, from a marketplace perspective. Words on art are not popular. Let's be clear here. People want landscapes. People don't want controversial statements, unless you're Jenny Holzer. At which point you're going to get paid a lot of money for your words on walls and other such things. But again, there is kind of a prejudice, I would say, against communicating in certain ways and then calling it art.
Well, can I ask you to that was another sort of pathway I wanted to explore, because you've talked a little bit about the success that you've had in these campaigns and everything like that. And you alluded to the difference in your approach and your style compared to another artist whose name is like
Zach
not
Foster,
sticking in my head, but I do want to plug everybody possible. So your show is Art Against Empire. Who was the other artist you mentioned?
Zach Foster. He has a podcast too called Seamside.
Zach Foster. Perfect. I'll collect all the links in the show notes. But I do want to ask you, you said that your style was very clean, clear, easy to read, right? And his is a little bit, it requires more of the viewer. Like, if things are going off the edges and wrapping around and everything like that, you have to sit and take time to decode and analyze. And for me, that's an interesting thing to think about strategically, like where and how do you make that determination of, I want this to be quick, instant, recognizable in your face, versus I want you to have to sit and mull this over and think more deeply. And so I want something a little more subtle and esoteric. And also, do you take the stance of like, I want this to be palatable and an easy entry point, or do I want this to challenge people in terms of like, a controversial statement versus the soft, invitation? You see what I'm saying?
That's a great question. No one has ever accused me of being subtle ever in my entire life. So I just think it would be outside of my artistic realm to not want to communicate quickly. I most certainly come from a pop art inspiration background. I communicate quickly. I communicate, again, kind of in a general idea. If we're looking at kind of like art antecedents to what I do, I very much see like, the queer art collective here in Canada called General Idea. What they did was fantastic to me. You put a poodle on a banner. It is what it is. It's a poodle on a banner. You don't.
Yeah.
You can think about it all you want. You're not going to get beyond that. Yeah, I mean, and their art is fantastically interesting, but it's immediately understandable what it is. You put thousands of AZT pills blown up, giant on the wall around you. You know what you're looking at. That's the art that speaks to me the most. I am not a person who spends hours in front of a painting in a gallery. I have ADHD. I move on, folks. I think the MoMA folks thought I was about to steal something. I was moving through their galleries so quickly, but that's how I consume the world. My absolute favorite place in the world is the busiest streets in downtown Manhattan and Montreal, where I live. I thrive on constant change and things happening around me. And I think part of what I want to do as an artist is give you a little bit of that as well. Is just like, yeah, so if you see one of my pieces, I was once a plant. Okay, well, yeah. In fact, the entire piece is made out of material that was once cotton, was organic. And yes, you can think about that more, but you're going to think about it maybe like a little bit further down the hallway after you've seen it or passed it on Instagram. And I guess that's the other aspect of this as well, which is I am an elder millennial. I'm a geriatric millennial. I don't know what to call it, but I very much grew up in an analog meets digital world that has been consumed by the desire and the need to communicate quickly. And I guess also as a political pundit, I mean, I spoke in silver bullet soundbites. I mean, that's my whole job, right? Was speak to time. There's a little thing in your ear and there's a producer saying, well, you get 20 seconds left, wrap it up. So you just kind of have to know how to communicate quickly, and also how to, yes, as to your question, agitate quickly, if that's what you want to do. And again, with a lot of my pieces, that is exactly what I'm doing. I'm agitating. I'm telling you to go do something. I have a series of public health banners that are very clear. Ask your doctor about the following medication. And again, they're inspired off of tattoo banners and those types of things. So again, if you look more deeply at it, you may get a sense that I'm doing something else. A lot of my banners have explicit military references. I use blue and red a lot because those are the regimental colors of the Canadian artillery. And it's colors that are burned into my head. Ecclesiastical banners, it always fascinated me as a kid. I would sit in these like military churches. I grew up on military bases, and I think somebody had to make that banner that wasn't there last week. The banners new every single week, Proverbs, whatever it is. Do they keep them somewhere? I'm not paying attention to church at all. I'm thinking about the logistics of the banners on the pulpit. So much so that I got a volunteer job to sort it all out. How does this happen? And I discovered that in the vast majority of military bases, you have a passementerie shop still, like a shop that makes fringes, brocade, cord, appliques things, pennants, you name it, because you need this stuff. So that sort of like, there's a queer sensibility to military pageantry that that they don't love admitting, and I love outing. So that's what I do, especially with my banner work. Is like, okay, I mean, it's going to be a little gay. You're going to look at it and go, what? I don't get it. And the other thing I do is I reinterpret historical artifacts. So I take images from the archives and I dig deep into archives. It's part of where Art Against Empire came from, was I just kept coming in and across these incredible things I wanted people to know. And one of the things that I do is I take these old protest signs, one, for instance, from the We Demand protest here in Canada in 1971, which was the first LGBTQ rights protest. And it says, "Gay is love." And I recreated it identically, but in quilt. I've done other ones with suffragette banners and I love that kind of taking something that is existing only in a photograph and figuring out literally how big it is. Like, how big would this have been? And replicating it as closely as I can, but in another medium. So again, it's asking people, it's very clear, gay is love. But then if you look at it a little bit longer, you read the artist statement, you go, oh, this is really interesting. Like, an actual human being held up a piece of cardboard in Ottawa, Canada in 1971, risking his job to write this and to put that out there. And now somebody, me, is doing it again in fabric in a much more permanent way. And I guess that's the other thing I love playing with, which is most of these banners get thrown away. You know, the banner at the front of the protest, like, it was, you know, all of these get piled up at the end. I know I've been on the cleanup crew where, you know, you pack away and you throw away and you recycle massive amounts of waste. And so that was the other thing I think about with the quilted banners, which is maybe these could stay around just a little longer. Because I also got very tired of just making things temporarily, you know, for a moment, for a photograph, and then thinking, oh, how could that last longer? So again, that kind of that interplay between the archival, the historic, and then my work is, again, something that I found I couldn't get fiber arts are slow. I admire my painter and ceramics friends who have such output. I mean, it's slow. It's piece by piece. They're very little letters. So I was like, what else can I do? You know, what else?
Yeah.
Again, I thought, oh, maybe a podcast, because I'm a broadcaster. It's what I do. I'm a TV person. I'm a radio person. So maybe if I take all this stuff in the archives that I can't put into fabric, I'll put it into like a patchwork of a documentary. So that's how the podcast came about.
That is such an interesting sort of, I don't know, juxtaposition of media to me. Like, you know, the modern digital media, short, quick sound bites that are, yes, there's a permanent record of them, but they're also like just memory hold so quickly and forgotten. Like that is strange to me. And then, like, at the same time, you're doing stuff that is so slow, methodical, labor intensive. You know, you say you're ADHD and you're flying through different places, but you can't really fly through a quilt. Like, that's just it's slow, painstaking, methodical work. And I find it really interesting that you're embodying and diving so deeply into both of those media. We've talked broadly about different work that you've done, but I always like to get into a little bit of the specifics. And I always like I find we get a different sort of an insight from a person's creative process and looking at one specific work and how did it come to be. And so could you walk me through a piece, any piece that you feel kind of represents your work, that you're passionate about, has a good story behind it, but tell me how it got started with the idea for it. Does it start with the cause? Did it start with like, I want to work in this medium for something more permanent? You know, the ecological impacts of waste at the end of parades and stuff like that. I'm trying to ramble a little bit to give you think time, because I know I'm putting you on the spot, but
no, it works. I know that. Yeah. I mean, I Was Once a Plant was my first official quilted banner. I had done other applique work and other quilts and so on and so forth, but it was my capstone assignment for my horticulture diploma from the University of Guelph. Because I move very quickly. I do a lot of things. I got bored. I needed another schooling. And I love plants, and I have a very large eco garden. So it was the culmination of all of these ideas, right? It was this moment where, because of the fact that I had spent 2 years doing school part-time, I kind of was forced into this moment of contemplation, of saying, okay, I'm ending this. This has been amazing. I've just learned so much. And also having a professor who was remarkably open to me submitting a piece of art as my capstone assignment. And usually in horticulture, your capstone assignment, to be clear, is like a garden or a garden plan or an extensive, you know, like a consultation project to put in a public space. You know, like he had responded, this is the very first time anybody's tried to put a quilt in, and it's the second time anybody's ever done art. go for it. And so once he had said yes, I was like, now I have to do it. Great. And it acquiesced into being both a question of the materials and the message. So I was like, well, I want to convey to my quilting friends and to the quilting world as a whole that the materials that we're using, in fact, have a biological origin. And that biological origin is deeply political, right? So like cotton only exists on the back of the transatlantic slave trade. We don't think about that as quilters. We don't want to think about that as quilters. We don't want to think about the fact that horticulture also exists on these tenants, right? So I thought, how do I get across and remind people that, yes, what they know is actually a lot deeper than that, right? So I picked only organic cottons. I sourced organic and used cottons. The words on the itself are made out of an old tablecloth that was forgotten for generations in a drawer here at my husband's house. And it was a kind of a beautiful linen, with a kind of a nice jacquard pattern in it. And I saw that jacquard pattern and I immediately thought, like, politics again, because that's where my brain goes. I thought, oh my God, that like this is, to put a little bit of that jacquard pattern on top of the organic and say, hey, listen, I was once a plant. It says this whole thing was once a plant. And guess what? This tablecloth, which is probably about 75, 80 years old, is the direct result of the politics that occurred because of this cotton. So I was once a plant. And then it got to travel to some quilt shows and some quilting guilds, and people ask these questions, and then they start thinking about the politics of their materials for the first time. Not just the historic politics, but like, where are they from today? Like, who made my quilting cotton? Was it made in a good place? Are those people being paid well? So that's it. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question that at first might seem kind of silly, but the words, I was once a plant. How did you come up with that? And why, like, I'm building to something here. Like, I know the obvious, like it came from organic materials and stuff, but like the specific phrasing, like I have to imagine, because, you talked about like you're interested in logistics and how things got there. What was that, just the first phrase that popped into your head to convey the message, or like how many other things, and how did you land on that specific phrase? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, probably a couple dozen phrases at least. I was once a plant came out finally when I realized that I wanted to speak from the perspective of the plant. So, in my practice, I now describe it in retrospect, because I didn't at the time. I now describe it as I make banners for causes real and imagined. And I imagined this plant just being like, hey, I've been through a lot. like y'all, I grew for you. You picked me. You threw me through the cotton gin. You've done all that. You wove me. You printed on top of me. Now you're here, and you've forgotten all of these origins. Again, we mentioned Zach Foster before, but his piece called Southern White Amnesia is very much of the same lineage, in the same idea of, his family owned people, right? And he discovered this, and now he's made an entire body of work about that. And again, I think it's part of that same notion of like, we forget things. Like, we forget our past. We forget our history so quickly that, in fact, by the time, the cotton is grown to the time that it becomes a piece of textiles, this is usually less than 2 years. But we've forgotten entirely. We've obfuscated its actual origin. And worse, in a lot of instances, we've blended it with plastics and things that are never going to be recycled, and. So it just becomes a jumping off point of like, hey, I was once a plant. Also says, is what you're wearing was also a plant? Is the rest of what was in your quilt a plant, right? A quilt is 3 layers, and the middle of it oftentimes is polyester, or bamboo, as they like to call it now, which is just viscose. It's polyester. So again, so you have these beautiful organic on the front and on the back, and then you fill it with plastic. So again, it was a question to my quilter friends. Why don't we think about this a little bit more? And a chance for me to talk about literally every aspect of the quilt, kind of like piece by piece, including the batting, which was organic cotton. So.
Did you consider other terms in there? Because like plant to me seems like a really interesting and deliberate choice, because yes, it hints at the organic, formerly living thing, But to describe oneself as a plant could also be like, I was placed here for, surveillance and like, like I was once a trade. I was once a narc, like I was once somebody who was put here, compared to like, I was once a living creature, or I was once, living organism, or I am now, a mashup of materials. You know what I'm saying? Like, did you do a lot of words? Like,
Yeah, well,
how deliberate were you with everything?
Tons of different words in there. Yeah, for sure. And then I think when I discovered plant, it's just such an all-encompassing category. You probably have one near you somewhere. Cool, great. Now you're tied to it. Like I was once cotton. I don't know what cotton looks like. Well, I know what cotton looks like. I don't think most people go, oh, I know exactly what cotton looks like. No, like a cotton ball, sure, I suppose. But I was once a plant can make you just, oh, okay, well, I got one near me here. Oh, yeah, organic, real. I was once a plant. But I love your interpretation of it as well. That's fantastic. I love it. I love it. Especially because I'm doing a banner about a plant, which is really weird, about an agent provocateur, which is a police officer who was placed at the beginning of a fundamental LGBTQ rally here in Canada, and was in fact a plant. He was there to cause a riot, and tried to, and then the queer folks who were marching were actually able to stop it from happening. I have a work underway right now where I'm going through the process of what I'm calling oglitteration, which is like taking glitter and glittery fabric to remove these three police agents from the protest, kind of in retrospect. I'm ogliterating them. It's kind of like obliterating with glitter. Ogliterating.
I see what you're doing there, and I love it so much. I in my day job, I teach elementary art. So I am sure that my lungs are like the most sparkly X-ray you could ever see. Speaking of microplastics and everything like that. But I love shiny things. So I love that you're using something that is bright and shiny and joyful as the replacement or obliteration of something that was less so, shall we say. Now, to just bring us back to the process for the "I was once a plant" piece, you've talked about quilts, and you've alluded to the fact that there are multiple layers to it. I mean, quite literally, but I know that not everybody listening right now is a quilter. So, can you talk about how the piece, like, just literally, how does it come together? Do you cut the shapes of fabric and lay them out and then stitch them together and then put it back? Like, how is this done?
This is my favorite topic is teaching people about quilting. So quilting is traditionally, but not always, 3 layers. The top is called the top. Then you have the batting or the wadding if you're in the UK, and then you have the backing. And the backing is usually one solid piece of fabric or a couple pieces of fabric put together, though sometimes more complex. And the top is where the art mostly happens, because when it's hung in a museum or those types of things, you want the front to be seen. Now, there are some very famous art quilts where they make use of both sides, which is stunning, and we love it when the galleries hang them that way. But the quilts themselves are usually done top first. So you have a decision whether it's a pattern-based quilt or whether it's a block-based quilt or whether it's an improvisational quilt. So pattern quilts are things that are done sometimes with a paper backing, sometimes called English paper piecing. It's very complex. It's very fiddly. If you've ever seen a almost photorealistic quilt at a quilt show, it's likely done with English paper piecing. Then you have a pattern-based or a block-based quilt. And these are the most traditional. The folks are most familiar with these types of quilts. They have the little stars. You've got a variety of different patchwork styles. And through that, it is a repetition of that block many different times in different fabrics and laying it out. Then you have a third kind, which is kind of art quilts, which use a variety of different applique, it's called, where we take pieces of fabric and either we sew them, which is called raw edge, without doing anything to the edge of the fabric, or something called needle turn applique, where the edge of the fabric is just turned under ever so that you get a really beautiful seam around the edge and it's not raw and it doesn't fray. It becomes actually quite an artistic choice whether you want it to fray or you don't want it to fray, or sometimes it's just a practical choice depending on the size of the pieces or how you do your work. Somebody like Bisa Butler, for instance, who's an incredible quilt artist, will applique in both styles depending on where in the process she's layering on that fabric, and what effect she wants it to have in its final form. So the quilt top is finished. Once it's finished, you need to make a quilt sandwich. That's the actual phrase. We call it a quilt sandwich. It's nice and easy, top and bottom, something in the middle. Usually this involves a lot of crawling around on the floor. If it's a very big quilt, you've taped the backing to the floor. You're pinning then 3 layers together with something called a quilt pin, which is like a safety pin that's got a little U on the end of it. Some people use like a spray, like an adhesive of sorts to keep all 3 layers together, because then the quilting is the action of using your sewing machine or hand quilting the 3 layers together. So that is, a lot of people say, oh, that's the quilting itself is those little stitches back and forth that are quilting it together. And then the whole thing together is called the quilt. And then the final step is to bind it, which is a pain in the butt. It's not fun. It's not fun to bind a quilt. I mean, most people don't go, yay, I can't wait to bind the quilt, which is taking some bias stripped fabric and you apply it to the edge of the quilt, you fold it over, and then most people, not me because I'm lazy, sew it by hand to the back of the quilt. So if you ever seen one, probably from your grandma or others, it's beautifully hand sewn to the back. I don't do that. I just run the whole thing through my machine and I'm done with it. But there you go. That's the basics of making most quilts. Art quilts.
What about your specific one?
So my specific one, yeah.
Which approach did you take?
So I took a mix of 2 approaches. Yeah, that's why I explained all. So I did the middle one. I did a block-based approach to mimic the squares of agriculture fields. So I put together small strips of fabric to kind of represent the rows, kind of stitched across them in big X's. But then the words are a raw edge applique on the top. So, and I chose a raw edge applique because, again, 1, I'm lazy, and a turned edge applique is so much more work. It's also a pain to do on a machine. I have arthritis, so I don't do most of my work by hand. I use my machine. But it also gives a lovely frayed edge that reminds you kind of the fabric itself. It kind of says, hey, this is a cotton linen. This is an interesting kind of fabric. Look at the edges of it. So yeah, it can be an artistic choice as well. Some folks will then throw it through the washing machine, especially if they want that fray to happen on a raw edge applique, and you can get the entire edge to kind of fray and kind of fuzz. So again, depending on how you then treat your quilt after, I Was Once a Plant is not a quilt that goes in the washing machine. It's like a banner-based quilt. It can be kind of brushed off and that sort of thing. Because again, the way that I did the raw edge applique is not particularly super secure. It's secure enough for an art piece, but probably not enough to put on your bed. It's also not big enough for your bed. But if you're doing a applique or art quilts for your bed, yeah, you're going to want to make sure those pieces are really well sewed down. And that's often done through a process called long arming. So oftentimes artists or quilters will send away their finished quilt, and then the sandwiching and the quilting is actually done by somebody else. And that's considered a whole other art form as well, right? So how they do that, whether it's freehand or by machine or computer, it becomes a big old debate in quilt shows and art quilt shows. But then you're jointly credited for the quilt. Most people would consider the primary maker to be the person who made the quilt top, and then one of the secondary makers to the people who did the actual quilting. But that's pretty common. That's kind of the history of quilting as well. If we look at quilts from Gee's Bend, which is a really famous place that inspires a lot of quilters these days, the quilts of the Gee's Bend makers, the women make those tops at home, and then they bring them to the community center and they do a huge, what folks would know as a quilting bee, right? You stretch it out across a giant frame and stitch it by hand in and out there together as a group, because it's just a lot more fun to do that part. It's monotonous, kind of boring.
You brought up Bisa Butler, whose work I absolutely love. I did an episode a while back about Bisa Butler, and her work is fantastic, often using like found photographs and bringing them a new life in the quilt, and the colors are significant to previous social movements and everything like that. And I've talked about the other, probably one of the biggest names in the world, Faith Ringgold, who did the story quilts as kind of a way to get her work out there and the stories out there before publishers were so interested in her. But you've alluded to history with Gee's Bend, obviously another famous name. what are some other artists or movements and historical stories with quilts for people to be aware of to really appreciate the significance of that as a movement, some foundational concepts that we haven't covered, and maybe some other artists you recommend people to check out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think any conversation about historic quilts would be a conversation without saying the name of Harry Powers, whose two remaining quilts are probably some of America's most important treasures. Um, we talk about it in the podcast in this most recent episode, but that quilt that survives, one at the Smithsonian and one at the Modern Museum of Art, are truly important in terms of the history of how particularly the African American diaspora has approached quilting as a narrative form, right? It is absolutely a stunning, stunning piece. I think any conversation about textiles also has to mention Ruth Asawa, who is a Japanese American sculptor and weaver who is trained in the school of the Bauhaus and Black Mountain. So a lot of folks like Annie Albers and Joseph Albers arrive from Germany. They go to the Black Mountain College. So folks are interested in kind of where the history of perhaps the legitimization of textiles arts, it definitely comes out of that kind of Bauhaus movement where, frankly, because of sexist reasons, a lot of women were sent to the weaving shop. But then unbeknownst to the vast majority of the men who were busy doing other things in the Bauhaus, they really broke the form and they innovated it beyond what the vast majority of weavers could ever conceptualize doing, right? So if we take a look at, again, Annie Albers is just, fundamental to all of this work. I also go back to an artist named Brian Geisen, not a well-known artist, I don't think. He passed away in 1986. He's a British-Canadian painter, photographer, and lover of William Burroughs. So the William Burroughs cut-up technique that was done for visual poetry, where you write out the entire poems, stacks and stacks and stacks of poems, and then you slice them in half and then mix up all of the poems. It's called the cut-up technique. That's Brian Geisen. He also created the Dream Machine, which people are more familiar with. It's his sculptural art, which was inspired by taking a trip down a Paris boulevard and having those the flashes of light that the trees created in front of his eyes put him almost into a hypnotic state. So he created a machine with another artist to actually replicate that state. I saw Brian Geisen's work, his very first major retrospective in his hometown of Edmonton, Alberta, when I was in high school, performing in visual arts high school. So I always have to say Brian Geisen is probably one of these like collagist textile kind of guys who always goes there. I mentioned General Idea before. General Idea, Felix Partez, A.A. Bronson, Jorge Zontal. Unfortunately, Partez and Zontal have both passed away, but General Idea was a Toronto collective that subverted mass media and consumer culture during the HIV/AIDS crisis. A.A. Bronson is still with us. He's an incredible artist who's doing just groundbreaking work. And I would also suggest people check out Brian Kenny, who's a queer artist in New York City who has worked in textiles. One of his more famous pieces is his American flag that's falling apart and into pieces. It's been replicated and put into actually high fashion clothes and other things. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Leah Evans and Alicia Merritt, two quilt artists who extensively use maps. And when I was doing I Was Once a Plant, both of those artists were incredibly influential. So just from a citational point of view, Leah Evans from Wisconsin, she uses NASA satellite images. Her work has been showcased in the Smithsonian and other places. And then Alicia Merritt is a UK quilter who does kind of hometown maps. They're very detailed. But again, I found a ton of inspiration in both of those incredible women. And I guess that's my last point, which is the vast majority of textiles artists and fiber artists, we are all standing on the shoulders of incredible women, right? Because of how this work comes to be, like, we are nothing without those women before us, particularly men in this particular space. So I think that's like one of my key lessons as well, that I'm, as best as I possibly can, constantly reminding people that my work doesn't come from nowhere. I mean, without Joyce Wieland, I didn't even mention Joyce Wieland, fundamental Canadian breaker of the quilt form, just had a retrospective here in Montreal. She literally invented pop art cut up quilts. I mean, that's like what she does. So like, again, nothing that I'm doing is particularly original. It is all very much informed by 50, 60, 75 years of very intentional work by women artists to legitimize within the academy, within gallery system, within the marketplace, that textiles and fiber is a legitimate medium. And I can't name any other medium that has had to fight so hard. Right. And I mean, I think that to me, there's just a massive amount of inspiration in that as well. They literally, like, textile artists have fought their way out of the basement into mainstream. And I should correct myself. There is one other form of art, which is indigenous art, of course, which has been long subjugated, again, into separate rooms, into other places, into a lesser place in the marketplace. So again, I think about these art forms that have been traditionally upheld and then carried on and passed from person to person. There's a reason I don't call myself a self-taught artist, because I'm taught by the community.
Yeah.
I mean, how could I possibly be a self-taught artist? I didn't figure out any of this all on my own. There is a massive number of incredible, almost all of them women, working in this medium to share and to teach. And that's my other really big point about textiles arts, which is that it's probably the most accessible of all of the arts, because of the amount of willingness for people to bring people into their studio and show them how to do it and to do it with them. It's very different than the kind of solo model of an often white male artist who's a singular solitary genius, apparently producing all of these incredible paintings. When what we actually know to be the truth is he's probably done some of the preparatory sketches, and there's 5 or 6 people studio assistants, assisting in getting the piece out the door. Or if you're some of the world's biggest artists, you haven't touched the piece at all, ever.
Yeah.
And then you backdated it.
Well, and I think, there's so many good points there. And, for listeners who want to continue to learn about these good points and benefit from these insights, your podcast is Art Against Empire. And I highly recommend people check it out, because you do cover a lot of stuff in a very thoughtful manner and provide insights that, I was not aware of very often, because this is an area that I haven't studied nearly to the extent that you have. But I think there's something really interesting about the way that, you kind of pointed to the fact that this is a medium where a lot of the expertise didn't come from the academy, it came from the community, and that it's passed down through generations. And I think there's something very tragic about the fact that that is the type of medium that is dismissed or historically marginalized, is the stuff that is what people do and interact with on a regular basis, and the way that people form genuine important connections. Like, there's something, I feel like it speaks to our collective prizing of the rugged individuality and myth making surrounding lone historical figures, and neglecting or looking past to the people who are more community oriented and those strong ties that are really important. And I think quilts and a lot of fibers are almost a perfect metaphor for that in our art history. And so, just to wrap this up, I'm going to ask one more thing from you, and that is, for those who are maybe hesitantly timid about dipping a toe into fibers, and maybe intimidated by the whole process and the labor involved in something like a quilt, how would you recommend people get started? The one thing that I have learned is a great hack for threading a needle. I'm going to share. If you take a tiny slip of paper, fold in half, put the thread in there, you can slide it through the eye of the needle. And that's the extent of my fibers knowledge. So can you share with people, like, if you want to get started, what should you do? Where should you go?
Take a course, take a class. because there's a ton of them. And whether that's an online class or whether it's an in-person class offered by a local quilt guild, they're often offering classes, or a local college. They're usually only about an afternoon, but take a class, especially on how to use your sewing machine. So I personally use a sewing machine constantly because I find hand stitching is just really, really slow, very laborious. So that's my first big tip is if you want to get into it, start with the machine. And if you feel like it needs hand embellishing later, which I sometimes do, you can always add that afterwards. And then don't be afraid to ask your quilt guild for assistance. It costs about $10 to join your local quilt guild. And this is one of the very few ancient guild systems that really does still exist, or has been revitalized. Obviously, it doesn't stretch all the way back to when guilds were a thing in the medieval ages, but it does go back to the 1950s and 60s. So you have an incredible wealth of knowledge in your very own community about how to quilt. And if all else fails, YouTube is the best teacher. If we take a look at the Modern Quilt Show or any of the SACO, which is the Society for Art Quilters Association, all of the best quilters will all freely admit that we love YouTube. I interviewed Stephen Towns for my podcast, who is African-American quilter, just had a show at the Wichita Museum. And, one of the very first things he said was, I didn't learn this from my family. I learned this from YouTube, and me too. And then one last element, which is, you can join us over in the Quilty Nook, which I mentioned Zach Foster before. It's an online community of what we call feral quilters. So if you find that the patterns are maybe a bit annoying and, you don't really want to do block-based quilts, there's this whole realm called improvisational quilting, where you can do whatever you want. Just sew 2 pieces of fabric together, cut them again, sew another piece of fabric. And then I guess that's my last really big tip, which is that fabric is so much different than ceramic and other mediums in the sense that it's deeply forgiving. So you cut in the wrong place, sew it back together. What's the big deal? You can't really mess it up too badly. If you do
the quilt won't blow up in the kiln.
It's not gonna. You got it exactly right. I say this to all my ceramic friends and the interviews that I did for the podcast. I was like, that's so scary to me. If I was just suddenly every 3 or 4 or 5 times I put my quilt in the washing machine and it just came out broken, I don't know that I would quilt. So it is deeply forgiving. Though that said, if you are putting your quilt in the machine, washing it, make sure that you're color testing your fabrics beforehand. Again, these are the types of tips you learn at your quilt guild and on YouTube, because everybody's had a quilt where, like when you buy that red t-shirt and it runs a little bit into the underwear, not ideal. Definitely not ideal if your quilt is bright red and bright white.
Yeah. And if you are quilting, don't put it into the kiln. It won't blow up, but it won't end well.
No, unless you're doing raku. That could be really interesting, like a raku quilt firing. That'd be a heck of a lot of labor to go up in smoke, but
But thank you so much. I really appreciate your taking the time and sharing your insights. Ian Capstick, the podcast is Art Against Empire. You can find links in the show notes, but thank you once again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.